Today we'll be discussing the third part of General Giap's biography. In this, we will be discussing his life by 4 onwards. After 1954, Giap became the defense minister in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But the problems of the government started because there was a brutal Maoist campaign for the land reforms, which was resented by the population. As a result, there was an uprising. So the Communist Party sent Giap to restore order. General Giap, using his popularity and the apologies which he asked the people, with the help of that, he was able to subside the anger of people. And because most of the people who were there, they had also fought with General Giap. So this crisis was solved by Giap. On the other side, in South Vietnam, No Dinh Dam, he had consolidated his power with the help of his brother. And in a referendum carried out in 1955, he proclaimed the creation of a Republic of Vietnam with himself as the president. And his government was supported by all the anti-communist countries like the USA, Australia, Philippines, all those people, all those allies, they were supporting him. And 1957 onwards, as part of the Vietnam War, they were facing the communist insurgency backed by the North Vietnam. North Vietnam, from 1954 to 1959, the Politburo was always debating on the strategy which was to be adopted to unify the country. That is to unify the South Vietnam with the North Vietnam. So for that, there were two camps. One camp believed that they should go in for a conventional war against South Vietnam and win over. The other camp, which was headed by Giap and the Mr. Chin, they advocated that the time should be utilized to consolidate the position of Vietnam in terms of economy and industrial infrastructure. And North Vietnam should develop as a bastion of communism, while at the same time they should keep supporting the comrades in South Vietnam to promote the first phase of the revolutionary warfare. So General Giap and Chin, they were able to prevail upon the others, and their strategy swayed from 1954 to 1959. In 1957, Giap was given the task by the party plenum, to restructure the units of the insurgents in South Vietnam, which Giap carried out to intensify the insurrection in South. In 1959, the plenum decided that it is the right time to escalate to the armed struggle in the South. So Giap ordered the opening of Ho Chi Minh Trail to improve the supply lines to Vietcong. These photographs show how the cycles and the porters were used to carry the supplies through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And Giap was also the chief of People's Army of Vietnam throughout the war against South Vietnam. He oversaw the expansion of People's Army of Vietnam from small self-defense force into a large conventional army equipped by its communist allies with considerable amount of weaponry and sophisticated equipment. However, this was not as good as ones given by the Americans to South Vietnam. In 1960, there was a split between China and Soviet Union. At that time, the Hanoi, which is the North Vietnam, leaned towards the Beijing. General Giap always had a resentment against the Chinese, and he felt that in the Dien Bien Phu, the Chinese did not advise them correctly. So he became a staunch supporter of pro-Soviet camp. And at that time, most of the people of his government were leaning towards Beijing. He was leaning towards the Soviet Union to the extent that he fomenting a coup with the aid of Moscow. In 1960, the government in North decided to openly abet the insurgency in South, and for that they formed a National Liberation Front, that is the Vietcong. The front, which was to disguise the leadership provided to the government groups in the South. For giving a credibility to this thing, Ho Chi Minh relieved Giap of his total control of military operations in South as a ploy. Since he was a Minister of Defense, he was responsible for the logistical and administrative support to the Vietcong. And from 1960 to 64, the military situation for the South kept deteriorating rapidly. While at the other end, US kept supporting the South Vietnamese government. Towards that, they increased the number of military advisors, they doubled the military assistance, and they also gave the authorization to use the napalm bomb, herbicides, and defoliants. But the situation got very worse in 1964. In February that year, at Kontom, American advisory compound was attacked by the Vietcong. May that year, with the help of the Vietcong, a US ship card was sunk off the shore in Saigon. And then in July, Nam Dong, a special forces compound was overrun by the Vietcong. North Vietnamese forces were also accused of attacking US destroyers in the Tonkin Bay. As a result, the US decided that all necessary measures to repel and any armed forces attack against the armed forces of the United States and to prevent any further aggression. North Vietnamese also decided to commit regular army units to war in the south. Though Giap was not in favor of that, he wanted the People's War to continue. That is the second phase of Daot Ran. Giap lost debate, so three reinforced regiments, after build-up through Cambodia, were sent to attack across the central highlands and drive towards the sea, splitting the South Vietnam into two. Towards that, in October 19th, an SF camp at Plai Mai was attacked by the 33 Regiment of North Vietnamese Army. Unfortunate for them, the 1st Air Cavalry Division had landed up, and that was used to relieve the camp at Plai Mai. The siege there was broken on 26th October with extensive help of the captors. As a result, the troops of 33 Regiment of North Vietnam started melting towards Cambodia, and some of them went towards Ia Drang Valley. At this time, General Westmoreland decided to use the division for offensive to seek out the fleeing enemy. But they did not know that the 66th Regiment of North Vietnamese Army had already joined the survivors of the siege of Plai Mai. So these survivors at the 66th Regiment, they regrouped southwest of Ia Drang Valley. On 14th October, US helicopters assaulted in the landing zone of Ia Drang Valley. They thought it is an unopposed thing. However, a stiff fight was given by 66th North Vietnamese Regiment. As a result, one platoon of US got cut off. They were able to extricate the platoon by 15th November, but there was heavy fighting. 2 days later, another battalion of USA walked into an ambush by the North Vietnamese. Both sides had heavy casualties, but the Americans were able to withhold, and with the aid of heavy artillery and air, the North Vietnamese remnants withdrew into Cambodia. So that ended the Central Highland campaign by the end of November. Now there were lessons to be learned from this campaign. Giap himself realized that they USA had devastating firepower and they had much better air mobility. Though earlier against the French, he had faced disadvantage in terms of the mobility and firepower, but he had never dealt with such a disadvantage of this magnitude. So Giap now was convinced that the only way to defeat the Americans was through a protracted people's war. The Americans, on their hand, had drawn their own lessons. They felt that with their firepower and mobility available at, they will be able to bleed the enemy to death. And finally, will be able to win the war through attrition. The communists in Hanoi felt that their army has been able to withstand a high-tech firestorm by the superpower, and it is sort of a draw. And a draw with the superpower is something like a victory. So they decided that from now on they will grab the enemy by the belt so that they will get so close that the RT and air of the enemy would be ineffectual. In 1966, both North Vietnamese and Americans increased their forces in South Vietnam. Americans started conducting extensive search and destroy missions. So this was a problem for Giap as he was not able to mount operations without inviting spoiling attack from the USA. His forces were pushed further from the population, which is required for the guerrilla warfare. But he continued to advocate his strategy of Dautran, though there was a lot of chorus against it by the Politburo, who called for the conventional war. In 1967, US ordered two largest operations in the area of South Vietnam, just north of Saigon. These operations were called Cedar Falls and Junction City. And they were in a small area called Iron Triangle, 12 kilometers north of Saigon. Nearly 30,000 troops were pumped in there. Initially, the Japs party lost large number of supplies and the men. Overall, they lost about 2,728 people. But these losses also bolstered the Japs critics to say that the communist movement was losing momentum in South. The critics called for a revision of strategy in the 13th plenum in March 1967. The plenum called for an all-out drive for a victory at one stroke. So in mid-1967, Politburo approved the plan General Offensive and General Uprising, shortly called TCN and TKN. For that, the Japs started preparing 81,000 tons of supplies and 2 lakh troops, including 7 complete infantry regiments and 20 independent battalions were built up by January 1968. They also pushed in a lot of arms to include AK-47 and B-40 rocket-propelled grenade launchers to arm the Viet Cong. As a deception, Hanoi launched a diplomatic offensive. The foreign minister, Trin, announced on 30th of December that Hanoi was open to negotiations if USA unconditionally ended the Operation Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder was an operation in which the USA was directly launching air attacks in the North Vietnam. So on 30th January, prematurely, the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong, they launched the attack in the South Vietnam area, in which civilian command and control centers were targeted. Next day, on 31st January, overall 80,000 PVN and VC troops struck more than 100 towns and cities. In these 100 towns, 36 provincial capitals, 5 or 6 autonomous cities, and about 72 district towns were addressed. Offensive was the largest military operation conducted by either side up to that point in the war. Because the enemy regrouped, they repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy casualties on the North Vietnamese force. The whole operation was launched with the premise that there will be a popular uprising and mutiny in the south. But it did not happen. Ultimately, this turned out to be a failure. It may be noted that there was a massive massacre in Hue area. Battle went on for about 1 month. So overall, the offensive was a military defeat for the North Vietnam. But the offensive had a far-reaching effect because there in USA, people started questioning the need of military intervention in Vietnam. They also wanted re-evaluation of the current war strategy, and there was declining support among American population towards the war because of the casualties. So ultimately, Johnson administration sought negotiation to end the war. The North Vietnam, however, wanted to press on. So General Giap ordered to replace whatever the losses, about 90,000 men were built up. They started planning for the new offensive, and on 7th May, Tate 2 offensive was launched. In this, attack was launched in 119 places. The offensive again failed and thousands were slaughtered. At this time, Giap and Chin claimed that Tate had tipped the balance of power in favor of the enemy. And they advocated that they should shift from phase 3 to phase 2 of Daut Run, that is the mobile warfare. With a lot of reluctance, the Politburo agreed to them, and Giap hurriedly passed a directive that never again and under no circumstances are we going to risk our entire military force for just an offensive. On the contrary, we should endeavor to preserve military potential for further campaigns. In the meanwhile, the peace negotiations started in Paris. In this, United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Viet Cong, and they were the parties. This started in January 1964. And because the Richard Nixon and Johnson both were convinced that there should be withdrawal of US forces from Vietnam. American troops were withdrawn only after 4 years. In the meanwhile, in 1969, on 2nd September, Ho Chi Minh died. In his absence, three more most powerful men emerged from the Politburo to lead the country. These three powerful men were Lee Duan, who controlled the domestic affairs, Pham Van Dong, Dong was leading the foreign policy, and Giap was controlling the military and defense matters. Most of the issues demanded approval of all three. Giap continued with his Dautran Phase 2 policy throughout 1969. So in this 69, he was only able to conduct small unit attacks and random shelling on USA and South Vietnamese installations. In 71, South Vietnamese decided to strike against the logistics trail of the North Vietnamese in the Kingdom of Laos. For this operation called Operation Lamson 719 was launched. The campaign was launched from 8th February to 25th March 1971. So as I said, the aim was to disrupt the North Vietnamese army's logistic establishment, logistical system. Now in this operation, the South Vietnamese forces collapsed when they faced tough resistance from the skillful foes. This campaign demonstrated continued deficiencies of the South Vietnamese forces and their military leadership. Even the best of the units of the South Vietnamese army were not could be defeated by the North Vietnamese army. So, bolstered by this success of defeating the very fine units of South Vietnamese army, the Politburo decided to launch a major offensive early the following year. This time, the Japs' influence was downgraded because of the failure in 1968. But at Laos, his strategy could find its way back. But in the next offensive, General Van Ten Down was entrusted to conduct the offensive. This is the Easter offensive, which was conducted from 30th March to 22nd March, October 1972. USA was expecting this attack in 72, but the size and ferocity of the assault caught the defender off balance. It was the first attempt by the Democratic North Vietnam to invade the South since the Tet Offensive and became characterized by the conventional infantry armor assault backed by the heavy artillery. Both sides fielded the latest technological advanced in weapons and systems. US forces started withdrawing in August. In October, the negotiations came to close to agreeing to the formula in which the US said that they will withdraw from South Vietnam in exchange for the ceasefire and they would require the American prisoners to be returned to them by the Hanoi. It was also agreed that the government of in South and North Vietnam would remain in power and the reunification would be carried out step by step through peaceful negotiations. Although the Easter offensive during the spring of 1970 was beaten back with high casualty, the proposal did not require them to leave the South. PAVN would thus be able to maintain a foothold in South Vietnam from which to launch future offensives. By March 1973, the US military personnel had left, all of them left the South Vietnam, but there was no ending in the fight. South Vietnamese attempted to regain communist controlled territories, inspired their opponents to change strategy. The communist leaders met at Hanoi in March for a series of meetings to plan a massive offensive against South. In June 1973, the US Congress, however, passed the Case Church Amendment, which prohibited any further US military involvement and the PAVN supply routes would operate normally without any fear from US. Giap had lost power struggle in 1972 shortly after the failed Easter offensive, where he was blamed for by the Politburo for the offensive's failure. Giap was also recalled to Hanoi, where he was replaced as a field commander of PAVN, and from then on watched subsequent events from the sidelines. The glory of 1975 was given to the Chief of General Staff, General Van Den Doom. Giap contribution to the 1975 victory is largely ignored by the official Vietnamese accounts. Now in South, Socialist Republic of Vietnam was established. In this new government, Giap was made the Deputy Prime Minister in July 1976. In 1978, he oversaw the successful Cambodian-Vietnamese War, which drove Khmer Rouge from power and ended the Cambodian genocide. In retaliation, Cambodian ally China invaded, that is the Vietnam War, which you are studying as a campaign. This invaded in 1979 and at Cao Bang. So Giap finally retired from this post as defense minister in 1981 and retired from Politburo in 1982. He remained in the Central Committee and Deputy Prime Minister until 1991. Giap wrote extensively on military theory and strategy. His works include Big Victory, Great Task, People's Army, People's War, Dien Bien Phu, and lastly, we will win. Giap died on 4th October 2013 at the age of 102 years. So that ends the part 3, roughly in about an hour. That is the all three parts. We have covered the biography of Giap. So all this should be used as a sort of a framework for you to remember certain things. We will be discussing the questions after this.